A colleague of mine was preaching a sermon series on the parables of Jesus, and he had almost decided to leave out the story of the prodigal son. It's too overexposed, he thought. We've become too familiar with it, and it's lost all of its shock value in our culture. But then he thought about it and decided, rightly, that he would be pilloried in his congregation if he preached an entire series on the parables of Jesus and left out this beloved parable. So he chickened out and he preached the sermon. Another colleague, on the other hand, has made the declaration that if he had only one chapter of the entire Bible to present the essential good news of the gospel, he would pick Luke 15. This story is a favorite. Why? What about it speaks to us so deeply? Without belaboring the story, I'd like for us to sit with it again this morning, because I believe that both of my colleagues are right. It is overexposed, and it is also the gospel. Now, you know these characters. I don't need to describe them to you again, but this bears repeating. You know these characters. You know the good guys and the bad guys. You know the people who can't be bothered to care for anyone but themselves. You know the old softy who crumbles with emotion. And what's more, we identify with these characters. We identify with the son who stayed at home and did what he was told and then seethed while his profligate younger brother was paved a highway with his parents, and all his misdeeds were just swept away when he came traipsing home. Others of us perhaps identify with the younger brother, sick and tired of hearing how fabulous his older brother is, finally cracks and says, "You know, I'm done with all this. I may fail, but I'll fail in my own way under my own steam." And still others among us identify with the beleaguered parent, affronted by his younger son, harangued by his older son. He stands in the middle asking, "Can't we all just get along?" Oh, we know these characters. They don't need explanation, but I think they do bear repetition. My colleague was worried they had become too commonplace, too ordinary, that they've lost their scandal because we've heard the story so many times in so many different ways. And the truth of the matter is we have heard the story rather a lot, haven't we? Henry Nouwen wrote his classic book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, based on the classic Rembrandt painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. We know the story backwards and forwards. Some of us have heard it 1,000,000 times. We've heard it so much we don't hear it anymore. But don't we always need to hear about grace? Here is a working definition of grace. It's actually my favorite working definition of grace, so you'll hear it a lot from me. Grace is the undeserved, unmerited, unconditional love of God. And God has a habit of wasting grace on sinners. Grace should never be something that is taken for granted. That is what Bonhoeffer meant when he cautioned Christians against believing in and relying on what he called cheap grace. Cheap grace is where we have become so familiar with the story, so blasé about it, that we actually begin to believe that because God has done everything necessary for our salvation, what we do doesn't matter. The ancient church called that antinomianism and ruled it a heresy with good reason, because they understood something fundamental. What we do does matter. It does matter at a deep level within our own identity, within our own selves. But, we in the Reformed Church are oftentimes so worried about salvation and being absolutely certain that we don't make it into some sort of a work we humans have to do on our own behalves, that we've almost rendered grace meaningless by our inaction, saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter." But here's the simple truth. What we do does matter. It matters a great deal. To believe otherwise is to believe in cheap grace. And yet at the same time, God has done absolutely everything necessary for the salvation of humankind. And that means that grace is real. It is unconditional. It is undeserved. It is unmerited. God doesn't demand anything of us to give us grace. And at the same time, if grace is to have any transformative power in our lives, if the narrative is to be any different after than it was before we encountered the grace of God, then we need to acknowledge that our actions and sometimes our inaction matter greatly. This parable is scandalous precisely because it shows how grace is so often wasted on sinners. The actions of the young man, pay close attention to this, the actions of the young man did yield consequences. There's no escaping that reality. You know how the story went. You just heard it. He wandered off into the far country and squandered it all in dissolute living. You can take your pick as to what that means. The legacy of our Victorian and Puritan forebears would leave us assuming that means sex and liquor, but really it could have been anything. It could have been anything. That's the beauty of this parable. It could have been anything. We don't know what made everything go so very far off the rails. We only have the older brother's word for it, that it was the one thing and not the other. Have you ever realized that something came out okay this time, but it could have gone so very differently? Have you ever had the sickening realization that your life could have gone a very different direction, but for the grace of God? If you've ever had that epiphany, you have a point of entry into this text. Or for some of us in this room, you know exactly what the end of the road looks like because you've been there. You've come home one day and realized the marriage is done for. There's nothing more that can be done for it. Or you've woken up the morning after a night too full of something or the other and thought to yourself, if I keep this up, I'm not going to last much longer. Or maybe you felt the weight of judgment because every move you made to correct a prior move went just as wrong, and now your finances are belly up, and you don't quite know what you're going to do next. If you know what it is to have averted disaster narrowly, or if you know what it is to have crashed headlong into disaster and had to clean up the pieces and sweep up the broken glass, then you know the power of grace. If you have any knowledge of the power of grace, then you have a way into the heart of this story, into the power of the unconditional love of God, the undeserved, unmerited inbreaking of divine kindness. And if you've never been stabbed by remorse or filled with a pang of doubt Well, this sermon isn't for you. Not yet, anyway. Scholars hypothesize that the pods in question were carob pods, which lack any real nutritional value. They won't do anything for you except make you feel full. And he would have gladly filled himself on them, but no one gave him anything. This is a story about grace, to be sure, but first we must acknowledge the underlying harshness of these words. Nobody gave him anything, because that tells us about the nature of the far country. The far country is an inhospitable place. Now, we know it had some clear allure for the young man, and if we're to place ourselves in this story, we must acknowledge that by extension, the far country has some repulsive allure even for us, if we're to take any meaning from this parable. What we know from that simple line, no one gave him anything, is that in the far country, you are on your own. In the far country, if you fall, there is no safety net waiting to catch you. You can sleep with the pigs, but kindly don't touch their food. We need them fat for the harvest. Now, I don't want to live in the far country. I don't know about you. But here's the problem. We don't have to go very far at all to find the far country. Do you know where the far country is? Almost every morning I walk by the door just outside my office right there, and I look to see if anybody is sleeping on the steps. And on the really, really cold mornings, if someone is there, I pause and I watch until I see some sign of movement so that I can be sure that no one has died on the steps of this church from exposure overnight. That, friends, is the far country. I have heard about the mission trips this congregation has undertaken and how a number of you have gone to Mexico City to visit the slums there. And I have a hunch those members of this church can tell us about the far country. 3 weeks ago, I took a tour of Manna, founded not too terribly long ago, right here in our own kitchen during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, and I suspect that those who founded that organization can tell you what the far country looks like. Nobody wants to go to the far country. We all know it's out there, and we know that nobody gave him anything. And then the story tells us he came to himself. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. Some scholars choose to interpret that rather charitably, graciously. They say he recognized the error of his ways. He knew he had done the wrong thing, that he wanted nothing more than to go home and have someone, anyone, care about him again. Other scholars are a bit more skeptical, a bit more cynical about his motives. They draw the conclusion he simply came to his senses. He's starving to death and the servants have food. Come up with a good speech, get home. The old man never could stand up to you anyway. Just lay it on thick. Con the old man. He'll crumble like he always does. And you know the rest of the story. He's spotted across the field. His geriatric father hikes up his skirt and takes off running for him, and it's a picture of grace. New robe, new ring, big feast. And then the far country comes home. There's that older son. Truly, he has done everything that ever could have been asked of him. He went to school. He paid his bills. He never asked his parents for anything. All he ever did was do right, stay home, take care of his parents. And suddenly there we are, off again in the far country. I have worked for you. I have slaved, and you never threw me a party. Oh, the far country is a lonely place. Did you know that you can get it all right in life and still wind up in the far country? Did you know you can do all the right things and one day your job's gone? It's cheaper overseas. And there you are, off in the far country. Did you know that you can work and work and work, and then somebody else gets the promotion? Somebody else gets the party. Far country. That's what's so poignant about this story. Every one of us, whether our life has gone off the rails or whether we have stayed close to the path that anyone would want us to follow, every one of us knows at some level what it is to hurt. It would be hopeless, the inevitability of this far country, if it were not for the relentlessness of God's grace. The 20th century theologian Karl Barth took this story and turned it on its head when he made the claim that Jesus is the Son who went into the far country on behalf of all of us. That Jesus is the one who went to a world where no one would give him anything and endured the sin, isolation, and pain of journeying into the far country for us. There was a movie about 20 years ago. It starred the late Robin Williams. It was called What Dreams May Come. It was a lovely film full of color and light. The basic premise is this. Williams plays a physician whose children are killed in a car accident. And then almost on the heels of that, he himself is killed in a car accident as well. And when he awakes from this accident, he finds himself in a world that is practically a cosmic playground. It is full of bright colors and light and joy, and his children are there, and together they play, and they are filled with joy at their reunion. And as they are filled with joy from time to time, they get a glimpse back into their former life, and they see there their mother and his wife. And it is so clear that she has collapsed into a world of fear and terror and chaos. And finally, feeling the enormous guilt that she has survived and they have died, and unable to save them in life, she elects to join them in death. And as she does so, she is plunged into a reality full of darkness and terror and fear, which I suppose could only mirror the darkness and terror and fear that she felt up into the moment of her death. And William's character, who has become convinced that nothing can be right in the world if it stays this way, undertakes a journey into the place of all of the darkness and fear and terror that his wife is enduring, in order to bring her out, to bring her to the world of joy and light and play and love. And so he does so, journeying through the terrors of her mind until he can reach her, and then clinging to joy himself, he brings her with him back into the world of light and love and color and play. when we say that Jesus Christ descended into hell, that's what we're saying. We are saying that he would journey even to death in order to bring us out to the place of joy and light and hope and goodness. And friends, that is why this is a story of grace. Because it highlights for us, it shows for us the depths to which our God would go for the love of humankind. And there's one more thing. It also shows the depths to which we, the church, are called to go on behalf of one another. In our baptism and in the baptism of others, we make a promise that we will go even to the far country with one another, because that is where Christ found us.